Do you believe that the Pakistan Navy is essentially what the Navy calls a force in being, which means that it's only a force in name?
What seems to have happened in Sindoor is that they just ferreted their fleet hit their surface fleet in Harbour.
Do you see it only a matter of time before the PLA Navy can now start deploying into the Indian Ocean?
The Indian fort and the fleet acting in combination could possibly have, the upper hand against the Chinese fleet, but we can never ignore the Chinese fort against the Indian fort and the Chinese fort against the Indian fleet. So we have to have countermeasures that way.
China's plans for this undersea sensor net that aims to turn the ocean transparent.
The word transparency itself is perhaps overstated.
Right.
Rarely is any awareness so transparent, even on land. There will always be room for question marks.
The Chinese system also seems to be about getting networks into place. You think this is the future?
We should not fall into a binary of platform-centric or network-centric. In fact, I personally always prefer the term network-enabled warfare rather than network-centric, because warfare cannot really be centered around any type of network or any type of platform.
There could be a race on the seabed in the next few decades for minerals and resources.
The Navy has to, look at the underwater domain also in its now, increasing complexities.
Right.
So when we are now talking about the Chinese getting cable cutters and all that, we have to think that, very little of what happens in the world is entirely new.
Right.
And one of the things that I suggest while teaching is that every war has been modern for its own time.
Of all the people in the world, the Houthis, and they've been able to interdict vessel traffic in the Red Sea. So what are the lessons from this?
More jointness is required, and thinking in sort of silos needs to be reduced. All this requires strategic imagination, operational brilliance, and tactical audacity.
Hello and welcome to the Sandeep Unnithan Show, your weekly dose of defense, geopolitics, and much, much more. Today, I'm honored to be joined on my show by Rear Admiral Sudarshan Shrikhande. Admiral Shrikhande was former flag officer, foreign cooperation, naval intelligence. He's a writer of repute, a strategic thinker, and of course, a visiting faculty to many war colleges. Admiral Shrikhande, welcome to my show.
Thank you very much, Sandeep, for having me over. It's a privilege. I'm very happy to be here.
Privileged, as always, to speak with you, Admiral Shrikhande, and we've been speaking for a very long time, several years, going back to South Block when I remember coming to your office when you were FCNI, and we were looking at emerging threats then, nearly 2 decades ago, 15 years ago, if I remember correctly. And today we're looking at the world which is in a sort of churn that we could never have even foreseen at that time. There are wars of attrition that are being fought. Russia, Ukraine entering its 5th year a few months from now. And of course, we've seen Operation Sindoor play out on the subcontinent, on the Indian subcontinent. I'll ask you all of that. But I want to begin by asking you about strategic planning. We keep hearing this thing about this element of surprise, that the military was surprised, or this government was surprised, or there was an intelligence failure leading to that surprise. This is something that you've been writing very often. Tell us why we need to plan to avoid such surprises.
I think strategic planning is at the root of strategic success,
right?
Or at least preventing strategic failures, whichever way it plays out. Because strategy is a dynamic process. There are, as they say, there are 3 issues about strategy that often, nations, national leaders, military leaders tend to forget. One is that the adversary also has a strategy.
Right.
The second, that it could be a smarter strategy.
Yeah.
And to outsmart him, we need to produce, equally smart or even more and smarter strategies. And the third is that the enemy always gets a vote on your strategic planning.
Right.
And therefore that has to have, a dynamism in that, and imagination in that.
Right.
And that's why I think we discussed this a few weeks ago, what I had written somewhere, that, no nation can really afford to have any strategic possibility off the table of discussion.
Right.
That is the strategic planning table, so to speak.
Right.
You can at the most, then assign some probabilities and put them on, not on the main strategic planning table, but on probably file cabinets that are kept to the side, figuratively speaking. And the point is that in each of these contingencies, planning effort has to go. And how I would suggest, understanding planning is really another word for thinking and writing.
Right.
It could be brief. It doesn't matter. Plans don't have to be, roomfuls, but they certainly have to be in sort of folders.
Right.
And I would say that I put it somewhere like this, that planning is preparation.
Right.
And preparation is not necessarily provocation. In fact, it rarely is.
Right.
But the advantages of preparation through planning is that preparation can become prevention.
Right.
And prevention leads to protection.
Right.
So, deterrence is about preparing for what we do not want to happen, not to happen.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned in this piece that I was looking at, strategic planning, you said, could prevent Pearl Harbors. That's what you've said.
So that brings to the other point that you had made about surprise.
Right.
So there are, usually 10 or maximum 11 principles of war that we learned as cadets.
Right.
Unfortunately, in much of sort of military education the world over, I guess, the simple 10 principles or 11 principles of war are rarely, analyzed, talked about, and drilled into the strategic planning process itself. Whether not only strategic planning, but at other levels of warfare, including operational and tactical. So surprise is something that has a great advantage if it is imposed on the adversary and not experienced by ourselves. So strategically, operationally, tactically, in terms of warfare or in terms of national planning, we have to prevent Pearl Harbors of that sort.
Right.
So the Pearl Harbors could be, think like the actual Pearl Harbor attack.
Right. 1941,
and there are correct. And there are dozens of examples that go back into history itself, including from our own ancient history and mythology.
Right.
So surprise as a factor. Our planning should impose surprise on the others.
Right.
Another way of saying this OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, is to surprise the adversary.
Right.
And unsettle him.
Right.
So surprises have an unsettling experience, whichever way. They can unsettle us if we've not thought about it. And they can unsettle the adversary if we plan for surprise.
Right.
Likewise, there are other principles of cooperation: concentration of force, economy of effort, selection and maintenance of aim. I mentioned concentration of force. There is morale, security.
Right.
All of these are there. But one major principle of cooperation, which we tend to ignore, is cooperation.
Right.
Cooperation across organs of government, cooperation within the armed forces.
Synergy.
Yes. Synergy. Right. There's another word for it, jointness.
Jointness. Right.
So the principle of jointness was enshrined really with the principle of cooperation, which in many ways I sometimes try and convey it is jointness plus.
Right. Jointness plus. But there's also something called, scenarios, coming up with scenario building. All of that. And do you think that this could be kind of drilled in when you anticipate these kind of events, where you, foresee that your adversary will do certain, A, B, C, and then you anticipate the thing, exactly what you mean?
Yes.
What kind of wargaming would you need to ensure this?
So I think armed forces, war game, armed forces exercise, and we do a lot of that. In our own lifetime, we've done that. And, in retirement, one participates where, veterans can be involved in that. Or I'm sure, the serving people in the armed forces regularly plan war games and exercises. So I think the essence is that we have to war game several scenarios. Hollywood does that.
Right.
One scenario we can war game, but Hollywood has war gamed it for us with reasonable imagination, is an alien invasion.
An alien invasion? You mean like Independence Day?
Like Independence Day.
But why would you war game an alien invasion?
So because it's very, very unlikely that it will happen. But in terms of the sheer sort of logic of it, if a race as smart as and occasionally dumb as we people, Homo sapiens on Earth, in a planet, there could be, hundreds of thousands of similar planets, solar systems, where life could exist. And they could perhaps come. These days we hear a lot about UFOs and a whole lot of things are going on, but not to sound flippant. That's an unlikely event. And yet,
Right.
some amount of thinking can be given to that. Or pandemics.
Yes.
Again, pandemics have occurred, with such frequency.
Yeah.
In this century, we've had, in this millennia, we've had already,
Yes.
in the 25 years, we've had, four pandemics at least,
Right.
the world over. India also experienced all four of them.
Right.
So these things can happen. Wargaming is something that is not only for militaries, it's
Right.
for corporate houses, it's for government ministries, departments.
Absolutely.
And to come together, we have to do that. But wargaming also requires professional integrity.
Yeah.
Into learning the lessons you might not want to instinctively learn.
Right.
So
there was that, very recently during Operation Sindoor, we saw the civil defense mobilization happening, air raid sirens, and this is the first time it's happening after almost half a century.
True.
And when you were saying this, I was just going back to Sindoor 6 months ago, where this is something we should have been doing as a matter of routine over the couple of years to prepare our population for these kind of eventualities. But staying on Sindoor now, you saw the Indian Navy deployed off the coast of Pakistan, far away in international waters, and the Pakistan Navy nowhere in sight. Do you believe that the Pakistan Navy is essentially what the Navy calls a force in being, which means that it's only a force in name, but it doesn't really project any kind of power? It's non-existent in conflict. What's your take on the Pak Navy?
The Pak Navy is certainly small, much smaller across all spheres of capability than the Indian Navy is. I think after 1971, they realized the vulnerability of their smallish surface fleet.
Right.
So they have concentrated on building their underwater capability. But equally important, they were ahead of India in getting anti-ship missiles fitted onto their submarines, as well as
they were the
shore-based aircraft.
Introduced submarines into the Indian subcontinent.
That's right.
First
they were the first ones.
Right.
So they realized that their sort of tactical and operational resources could be put into these dimensions more than the surface dimension. What seems to have happened in Sindoor is that they just ferreted their fleet or hid their surface fleet in Harbour. Of the 3 submarines they have, perhaps 2 might have deployed 3. That I wouldn't know. But whatever it was, that was about what they could do. The other aspect, therefore, coming back is what I've been saying is that the way maritime nations and continental nations need to think of the fort and the fleet. In combination, in concert with each other. That means one nation's fort and fleet to fight another's fleet, or another's fort and fleet, or another's fort.
So what do you mean by fort and fleet? And what is a fort? I mean, the fleet, of course, is
that's right.
Understood. But what's a fleet?
So, for our viewers, the fleet in a simplified way is all that exists at sea. And in terms of in all dimensions, the air dimension, the surface dimension, and the underwater dimension. And the fort is something like the Indian Navy has a fair amount of fort that is built into its capability, which is shore-based aircraft, shore-based missile batteries, and in many ways the cyber and space support, which is essentially controlled and commanded from land, but in service of all dimensions. And the fort itself, the army, the air force of any nation constitutes the fort. So fundamentally, the ability now of the fort to impact in its strategic and operational functioning objectives overseas has increased with time in terms of the ranges of shore-based air power, the ranges of missiles that can be fired from land, the satellite coverage that is controlled mainly from land, the cyber that can be controlled mainly from land. So all these 5 dimensions, air, sea, land, space, and cyber, working together is I would suggest is the fort and the fleet for simplicity of understanding. In other words, combined joint operations. for certain objectives, which might be more biased towards one dimension or the other dimension at a particular stage of a conflict or prevention of that conflict.
Right. So, how good is the Indian Navy's fort versus the fleet, and how would you use them in conflict?
Okay. So I would say that the way the Chinese have been working on it, or the Americans, or the Japanese, or the Indians, is that you try and use them in combination through planned, through plans. That means the thinking for those plans has been made adequately, and the execution is also joint. Which means it's not only the fort that is available to the Indian Navy in terms of Indian Navy markings,
right?
But missile power that is shore based. And yes, it could be ballistic missiles, it could be cruise missiles
used by any service.
It could be all this used by any service.
Right.
All in service of certain objectives which are predominantly on land, or for power projection, as we say, onto creating that impact on the enemy's terrestrial sphere.
Right. So in the recent conflicts in the last couple of years, we've seen what you would say that the fort has become more powerful now because of the addition of long-range vectors, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles. You've seen, of all the people in the world, the Houthis, a ragtag so-called maritime force, a guerrilla force, a landlocked guerrilla force, operating in a country with a very strategic coastline, Yemen, and they've been able to interdict vessel traffic in the Red Sea. So what are the lessons from this for the Indian Navy? You think there is some valuable lessons there that we can imbibe to reshape our employment of such vectors?
Yes, I think there are lessons which we have to learn, and I see us learning them. There's a lot of thinking about all these conflicts that is going on in the Indian Armed Forces and in the larger Indian strategic community itself, and those are important lessons. The fort and the fleet have to be seen together. I think we should not think of the fort that is enshrined in the fleet or under naval markings or air force markings. I think we need to get over that. It doesn't matter whose ordnance hits the enemy where.
Right.
So long as it hits, so long as it is massive.
Right.
Depending on the objectives at the operational or tactical levels to be achieved, and it achieves ultimately the political objectives that were set out.
Right.
So to that extent, the simpler answer or the simpler response to this would be more jointness is required, and thinking in sort of silos needs to be reduced.
Right.
And that is something where, at least from what one sees of the Chinese, they have been probably more successful at breaking down the silos than has anybody else. I'm sure it is not without problems. I'm sure it is not without terse sensitivities. But they are, I suppose, better positioned, and they exercise a lot more in sort of joint distributed military operations.
Right. And coming to China, since you mentioned it, the shipbuilding has been explosive. There's no other way to categorize how they've been adding warships, submarines, fighter aircraft, and aircraft carriers to their fleet. And there's talk of China crossing a 500-ship navy in the next decade or so. What are the lessons that we can take from this, and what does this augur, this explosive growth of the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, what does this augur for India's maritime defense? Do you see it only a matter of time before the PLA Navy can now start deploying into the Indian Ocean in our area of influence?
It's difficult to sort of speak for what the Chinese might do, but what we need to do is to start thinking what is it that they might do or not do.
Right.
And what
scenarios, I feel, the scenarios that you mentioned,
yes,
to avoid being taken by surprise.
That's right. So again, the Chinese fort and fleet will be used against the Indian fort and the Indian fleet.
Right.
Likewise, we need to respond, in analogical ways, which means, build up our fort, build up our fleet, and use in terms of future wherewithal that the fleet ought to have, use it to impact the Chinese fort in the Western Pacific.
Right.
So with partners, by ourselves, if required, if we can think of the Chinese operating in the Indian Ocean without partners or with one or two partners, then we should be also thinking of those issues. After all, say the distance between Hainan and Chennai is the same as the distance between Chennai to Hainan.
Right.
So if we can think, and if we have observed them deploying here,
right,
and we are deploying. But this brings to another point that deployments or presence in non-conflict situations is quite different from when they sort of arrows start flying.
Right.
When the shooting is very likely to start or has started.
Right.
They are very different for both sides, the attacker as well as the defender. And if that were to start, then the Indian fort and the fleet acting in combination could possibly have the upper hand against the Chinese fleet. But we can never ignore the Chinese fort against the Indian fort and the Chinese fort against the Indian fleet. So we have to have countermeasures that way. And I think I put it in these words somewhere in a chapter in a book, that all this requires strategic imagination, operational brilliance, and tactical audacity.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, fascinating. And, speaking of which, we were speaking a few days back about China's plans for this undersea sensor net that aims to turn the ocean transparent. It's a fascinating concept where China plans to, literally convert the ocean into, give them underwater domain awareness of the kind that now exists on the surface of the ocean, where you would be able to see clearly what is under the surface of the ocean. How realistic is this?
I would say that the aspiration of nations, their armed forces and navies, has been to create, maritime domain awareness, of which underwater domain awareness or aerospace domain awareness are subsets.
Right.
So to that extent, the aspiration of increasing transparency that is available to you on the adversary in depth, width, and in density has always been something that navies have struggled for and succeeded slowly. But along with this success comes newer fogs that the enemy can impose on reducing the amount of transparency that the other side has. And this is also a game that has continued for a long time.
This game of cat and mouse.
Cat and mouse.
Right.
So it's not that transparency will mean 100% transparency, or you can even quantify that. But the chances are, just like terrestrial transparency is increasing, maritime transparency also has been increasing.
Right.
And we all realize that. The second aspect is that the word transparency itself is perhaps overstated.
Right.
Rarely is any awareness so transparent, even on land. There will always be room for question marks. There will always be a bit of a fog, but you can penetrate that fog. You can create newer types of fogs. So I would say that in the underwater domain, a lot of effort and research is going on, and from all reports, including the one that you refer to, the Chinese are spending a lot and putting in a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of technology into newer ways of detecting submarines, which could be very small ones now, and using newer waves, newer technologies, quantum technologies, etc., to be able to detect that. How successful it would be, I would say that we have to accept again that it could be successful. Just like in the 1930s and 1940s, there were big skeptics of acoustic detection of submarines, and sonars. And there was skepticism amongst the Japanese that there could really be no way a device like a radar could control gunfire, for instance. But the Americans were deploying radar controlled guns on their larger ships, and they were using airborne radar. The Japanese were unwilling to accept in their Bushido style that all we need is firepower, and ignored sensors, or ignored the transparency, or did not build as many patrol aircraft,
or sonar equipped
warships. So they developed, as you yourself, I think, written about their torpedoes.
Yeah, the long lance
torpedoes.
Right.
So they developed the weapons,
yes,
but did not put commensurate efforts
right.
in the more boring
Yes.
tasks of detection, tracking, and therefore ordnance. So ordnance is the ultimate bad news that you can deliver.
Right.
But to deliver that bad news, you need networks, you need a lot of awareness, domain awareness.
No, and as you were mentioning, I was just going back to that very graphic of the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the number of warships that were destroyed. More than 2,000 merchantmen was sunk, and literally that empire collapsed. That thalassocracy that Imperial Japan was just collapsed because they could not protect all their naval assets. But, this thing of networks that you mentioned, and the Chinese system also seems to be about getting networks into place. You think this is the future rather than, we tend to become very platform centric. The Air Force is being accused of doing that, being, focusing too much on fighter jets rather than building the networks. When you're looking at the maritime dimension, so the Navy has been way ahead of the curve among any other service. If you putting, sensors, putting networks into place, where do you see this kind of heading in the next couple of years when you're faced with such a formidable adversary like the PLA Navy?
Yes, so I feel again we should not fall into a binary of platform centric or network centric. In fact, I personally always prefer the term network enabled warfare rather than network centric, because warfare cannot really be centered around any type of network or any type of platform, whatever be the platform, including a nuclear attack submarine or a carrier or whatever it is. So every navy or every service in most countries does have certain platform centric biases, I would say. But it's not that they have not gone into networks.
Yes.
They have developed networks, and they continue merging the platforms and enabling them to use these networks better and better, right up to from detection to platform positioning and finally delivering ordnance on target. So all of this has happened, but I think writers can create a feeling of binaries, this or that, but it's usually platforms and networks. It's not platform versus network. You've got to invest in both, but you've got to invest in platforms, networks, and ordnance capabilities, and defensive networks, defensive platforms, and defensive ordnance also. Some of which has dual applications of being offensive ordnance also. And there's nothing new about this. This is the way, much of warfare has been for the last 200 years. The Turks demonstrated the efficacy of forts when the fleet is operating next to forts in the First World War, for instance, in the Dardanelles campaign, where, many battleships were lost to mines which were kept close inshore and deployed from land, through makeshift platforms, and created a network of ordnance that was, distributed. Mines are, unmanned ordnance, stationary drones or floating drones in that manner. And they had a lot of effect in really increasing the problems for the Royal Navy.
And, now 100 years after that, you're looking at the underwater realm becoming the new domain for conflict. There's a lot of investment going on in undersea warfare capabilities, not just submarines, but going down to the seabed, because you have your seabed cables which carry your internet. Literally more than 90% of all our internet traffic, as the Navy Chief Admiral Tripathi has mentioned recently. You see the need for a dedicated underwater focused directorate or a command, say within the Navy. I'm guessing aloud because it's only the Navy that has these kind of capabilities. Looking only at the underwater domain awareness part of it. You have a surface Navy, you have submarines, of course, but going beyond that, when you're looking at policing the seabed, or fact that there could be a race on the seabed in the next few decades for minerals and resources, do you see a need for a specialized directorate to focus on this part of?
I quite agree that the Navy has to, look at the underwater domain also in its now, increasing complexities.
Right.
But navies have historically been part of protection, but historically have been, more in terms of sort of disruption for the enemy.
Right.
So when we are talking about cutting undersea data cables,
yes,
we have to go to the, see the example of the British Navy in the first few hours of hostilities having been declared between Britain and Germany in 5th of August 1914, where within a few hours, in a very planned way, British telegraph laying ships had been trained, equipped to use grapnels, bring up cables, and 2 major cables were cut within 10 hours of hostilities being on. That was the first offensive action of the British Navy done as a whole of government planning and whole of government execution. So when we are now talking about the Chinese getting cable cutters and all that, we have to think that, very little of what happens in the world is entirely new. And one of the things that I suggest while teaching is that every war has been modern for its own time.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So certainly internet data cable and the amount of today, I think India earns more from services trade than it does from trade in goods. Services trade, in fact, has been on the growth much faster than trade in goods. In fact, trade in goods, has the graph has actually flattened quite a bit. And it's likely to dip, depending on global economic conditions. But during COVID, for instance, data traffic, increased manifold across, landlines, land circuits, and
we were all completely dependent on.
We are all completely dependent.
Internet.
I mean, today, citizens of all countries. I only half joke, I guess, that most people would probably, not realize that oxygen is being sucked out of the air. But if there's data disruption on their phones, they'll probably understand it faster than realizing that they are being asphyxiated. So data asphyxiation, I would say, is perhaps something we need to worry about. So coming to the specific aspect, yes, the Navy perhaps needs to think of this underwater domain, but I imagine the Navy has been thinking about it. I do not know if a directorate is being contemplated or, might be necessary, or if it could be a subset of all that the Navy does. It's for the current leadership to take a call on this, but it is something that it's not only the Navy, but the whole of government which needs to look at that. And indeed, bilaterally and multilaterally, through the quadrilateral or the Australia-India cable partnership network that is going on, a lot of thinking is going on because this is a huge commercial earner for most countries. It is something we will possibly notice, goods missing from supermarket and the Kirana store shelves slower than data going dark or cables being, data being disrupted. That most of us will find in the next few minutes that our phones are not connected to data. It might take a bit longer to say that, rice and flour is no longer available on shelves.
Oh, that's really alarming, the scenario that you've painted. But how can the Navy kind of, be proactive in this, Admiral Shrikhande? You see this directorate as in physically protecting the cables, because there are a lot of investments, as you correctly pointed out, by the Chinese in cable cutting ships.
So cable protection, or, we have to probably think of the vulnerability of cable landing stations by, protecting the ones we have, distributing them, in greater places so that there's you've got now alternate pathways. Just like the interesting thing about cables is that ships can sail on different routes, but cables are physical cables. When we talk about digital trade, we tend to forget that there's a lot of physical elements of that digital trade. In terms of data centers, which are huge, which have huge requirements of electricity and water, in terms of cable landing stations, and in terms of cables itself that take all this data all over the world. There's a lot of physical infrastructure. All of that infrastructure has vulnerabilities, and it's like there are two ways of attacking merchant ship trade. The more doable, less complex way would be to attack ports that are sovereign to the adversary. rather than attacking ships at sea, which now can create complexities. It's not that cannot be done or need not be done or should not be done, depending on the circumstances. But attacking ports, should conflict, go to that level, is probably a better way of doing, of trade warfare, for instance.
Right.
So likewise, data centers, cable landing stations, and the shallow portions where cables exit or go into the cable landing stations. So those are areas where it's not all of it is the Navy's responsibilities. I don't think we should take on responsibilities which more fittingly belong to other organs of the government.
Right.
But as I see now, the Indian establishment is looking at a whole of government approach towards digital trade. Right. All of it requires all this. Just like physical trade will require and has required protection, and nobody stopped thinking of the possibilities.
Right. So in terms of if the Navy actually did enter this realm, would it be, say, what it was like in the 1960s when the Navy entered a whole new dimension when it required submarines? The submarine arm was raised. What would be the contours of a directorate or a command like this in terms of personnel, in terms of training? How would it, be founded and formed?
It's a good question. I must say I've not done too much thinking about this. But just like we trained people for missile warfare,
right?
Just
a few years after we bought submarines.
That's right. Just like we trained submariners,
right.
We will have to train people to think about all these issues.
Right.
Right now, there is reasonable capacity within naval people to think about these things. But I think we need to along with the width, go into now the depths of this thinking.
Right.
And perhaps there have to be sections like some other navies have, and we used to have trade warfare,
right.
Which could include now digital trade, both protection as well as disruption of an adversary.
Yes.
So fundamentally, again, it's not different. It's not different from what telegraph cables were, 150, 180 years
right.
From now. Today, telegraphs have passed into history.
Yeah.
But
they've been replaced by the internet.
As we understand it today.
Right.
But in senses of principles, I think not much is entirely new.
Right.
It is different only in details,
right.
and in the complexity and in the spread of data.
Right, absolutely. And when you were mentioning commerce interdiction, I was just thinking about commerce destruction, maritime warfare that the Navy did so successfully and very quietly, as is the Navy's capability during the Bangladesh War, in the run-up to the Bangladesh War during Operation X. That's a subtle book plug for you viewers there. Those of you who haven't read my book, which I co-wrote with a legendary submariner, Captain M.N.R. Samant. Operation X details how the Navy has always been ahead of the curve in all of these aspects that Admiral Shrikhande mentions, whether it's missile warfare, it's commerce destruction, all of these things, carrier operations. I mean, 71 war, we've seen some outstanding examples of carriers being used for shore bombardment, interdiction missions, all of those. But we're coming to another anniversary of the 1971 war very shortly, Admiral Shrikhande. It's been, 54 years since the Navy was last used in conflict. What are the lessons, you think, from 1971 that endure till today, 2025, more than half a century later?
Looking back, I must say that I barely knew about, the details of Operation X until you wrote that book. In fact, when I'd written a chapter on grey zone warfare at sea, arguing that grey zone is for everybody, not only bad guys as might be defined at a particular point by somebody as who the bad guys are.
Yes.
The good guys also, operate, live, and need to succeed in the grey zone itself. So, but I had not mentioned about that because there was no publicly available information for that. So I think you created that opportunity of bringing the Operation X story to the world. And the way I look at that operation where we need to study that a lot more.
Yeah.
How, 4 or 5 months before open hostilities, we operated in the gray zone. How, a small band looking at the principles of war, of security, surprise, economy of effort,
Yes.
and concentration of force with small numbers. In many ways, we need to look at. I don't think you use the line that this was a good example of a swarm attack.
Yes.
We tend to think of swarm attacks as a new concept, but it was a swarm attack.
Absolutely.
where synchronized in time,
Yes.
distributed in terms of place, but impactful.
Yeah.
Very similarly in terms of the effects it had, immediate effects it had, and the long-term effects it had.
Right.
It was a swarm attack.
Yes, absolutely. 170 naval commandos
That's
converging
right. Along with Mukti Bahini, swimmers who were trained.
Right.
How do you train people for such contingencies?
Right.
And the secrecy with which this planning and execution was done, to the extent that, from what I know and from what you've written, that most people in the Navy did not know that such planning was going on.
Right.
It was a joint operation because Fort William was, I think, as you mentioned, supporting it a great deal. General Jacob, for instance, provided a lot of leadership, and naval headquarters and many in the commands did not know what was going on.
Right.
And it was a complete surprise. So the principle of surprise was great.
Yes.
But it had important, downstream consequences, as you mentioned also.
Yeah.
In terms of the impact it had on the Pakistani occupation forces in then East Pakistan.
Yeah.
In terms of, going into a siege mentality.
Yes.
Of investing a lot more in force protection and having lost a lot of logistics, both in terms of the goods that were destroyed and the ships that were sunk alongside.
Absolutely. And in fact, since you're mentioning this, the operations in the run-up to the 71 war were actually in support of the Mukti Bahini land forces.
Yes.
And they were directed against the Pakistan military, not so much the Pakistan Navy.
Yes.
They were actually attacking the Pakistan army's sustenance, the supplies, the ammunition, the food, and the exports, the foreign exchange and all that, which is why I think, the Navy has always been so forward-looking. And I believe,
the Navy, if I could say, the Navy's fleet, attacked the fort deep inside and created downstream consequences for the Pakistani fort, existing in East Pakistan that time.
Right.
And in many ways, to date, this has been the largest special ops that India has, mounted deep inside what was then enemy territory.
Absolutely. East Pakistan. And the fort collapsed.
And the fort collapsed, in many ways.
Right.
And the logistics line was deeply disrupted because the few ships that they had at that time were, now sitting hulks alongside for the rest of the war. And there they remained.
So here's what I think about the 71 war, Admiral Shrikhande, and, bear me out on this one. But I believe that the 71 war was actually the birth of the modern Indian Navy.
It was.
You agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that.
There was an Indian Navy before 1971. There's an Indian Navy after 1971, which is more aggressive, which is more, self-sufficient in the sense, realizes the importance of indigenous construction. Of course, with all the, attendant risks of mastering technology, we are still not self-sufficient, in a lot of areas. And I'm looking at 2025 where you have warships. And this is a question that we've asked your colleagues as well. When you look at, say, certain destroyer classes, where you have gas turbine engines that have come from Ukraine or from the United States, helicopters that have come from the US, radars and sensors from Israel, missiles from Russia. We've managed a very fair mix of systems, radars, integration very well, which could actually be an Achilles heel in conflict right now because all of our suppliers are in conflict of their own. The US, and they've weaponized spares, they've weaponized support. They demand certain compliance from you because of the way the world is today in 2025. You think in hindsight, this was the correct thing to do, or what should be our lessons from this state of play?
Yes. So I think, I would say that even before 1971, one of the most successful indigenization projects was the Leander class.
Right.
And, when we talk about India not producing its own gas turbines, even under license.
Right.
We had produced steam turbines in the steam plant,
Right.
the Y160, if I remember right, of the Leander class in India.
Yeah.
And it was being produced, much of it within the naval dockyard itself and with other suppliers.
Did we use them in the Brahmaputra class as well?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, we did. So, the Leander class indigenization was one of the most successful build-to-print projects, which we now, have almost forgotten.
Yes.
And those ships were actually built faster in its own way than many other later classes.
Right.
So you're right about the many flags, national flags that go into our ships, and that obviously is a vulnerability, as we've realized time and time again, as any country which is so import dependent would realize. And therefore there is self-reliance, Atmanirbharta is a no-brainer actually, and we need to put in more effort, more sweat, more thinking and more determination into it. And I think we are doing that, but perhaps not sufficiently well enough and not without sufficient determination. On the 71 war, I would like to suggest one more thing, which was a change, is that was one period where, we were looking at alternatives.
Right.
Realizing that we needed another alternative to attack the enemy's fort.
Right.
And the fleet that was operating close to the fort, we used the missile boats very creatively.
Right.
Instead of using the aircraft carrier, whose vulnerability would have been greater, so it was used in a less vulnerable, part of the ocean, which was the Bay of Bengal. And it was used in a manner when the threats to that carrier, we had a better estimate of what the potential threats to that carrier were. So I think these choices were made, and as our official history says, that they almost didn't get made.
Right.
And as you've written about the missiles itself.
Yeah.
In 64 we had declined buying missiles, saying that this might not work.
Right.
How can an anti-ship missile home on to a moving ship, etc.
Right.
It's too far-fetched.
Right.
But the 1967 use of that missile in peacetime or in no conflict or grey zone by the Egyptians opened our eyes to that possibility. And to be fair, the Indian Navy made rapid decisions. Right. The question is that had we decided to go in for missile boats in 64, we might not have had them by 65, but we would have probably rehearsed them, had more of them, and practiced a lot more, exercised a lot more than having acquired the missile boats only, I think, in 1970 and 71, and deployed them, fresh from the factory, so to speak.
Right.
We could have had, greater ability to exercise them, learn some more. But nonetheless, despite that, the dynamism of the leadership ensured that these attacks went through. Unfortunately, after 9 December, it was just a series of cancellations of more such attacks that we could have pressed home.
Right. And 50 years later, you're looking at your adversary who's not really, built up to a level that he can challenge the Indian Navy. So my question then is that, does this allow the Indian Navy now to focus a bulk of its attention towards the other threat that's in the Indian Ocean, which is the PLA Navy? Given the fact that how, the imbalance between the Indian Navy and the Pakistan Navy, which just continued since 71, does that allow us to project more power against the Chinese? It
could, but we go back to the first part where we began, is that nothing should be off the strategic planning table.
Right.
And I don't think we can afford to have Pakistan off that, Pakistan-based scenarios and actuals off that table. So now comes the other aspect of the axis, the Islamabad, Rawalpindi, and Beijing axis. So that creates its own greater challenges to us, and some of those challenges we saw during Sindoor itself, in various dimensions.
Do you see that in the maritime?
So it could happen. It could happen as Pakistan acquires more submarines.
8 of them. They're buying 8 submarines.
Yes, it could. And we have to now build up our ASW capabilities even further.
Right.
So I don't think we can ignore Pakistan, or we can say we can handle Pakistan, because there could be situations where we might have to counter. In terms of the sort of line that I use, planning is preparation. And preparation is not provocation, but preparation is possibly prevention. So we'll have to plan for all these contingencies, and Pakistan can never be off the table, at least in the foreseeable future. And Pakistan, I think, realizes that the maritime dimension is its weak area.
Yes.
That's why from the mid 1970s, they have also put in a lot more effort in the earlier stages, more than we did, or earlier than we did, into reorienting some part of their fort to counter the Indian fleet.
Right.
That we expect that they might do that more.
Yeah.
Take a leaf from what the Chinese are doing with their fort, what the West calls A2AD, anti-access area denial.
You see them building up now on that.
They could perhaps be doing more of that. Pakistan needs in its littoral a sea control because it needs to keep some amount of its commerce flowing.
Yes.
And that commerce could be under threat, both from India. If we get into a more complex conflict, they understand that, and they understand that the Indian Navy really has the capability to do that, and which we demonstrated. The potential was demonstrated in Sindoor. It was demonstrated during Op Vijay. It was demonstrated, during Op Parakram, the 2001 deployments. So they are aware of that, but they will also try and counter that. I mean, all strategy is about finding solutions to problems. It's about looking at more cost-optimal, cost-effective solutions for budgets that are limited almost for everybody. And I guess even China has budget limitations.
Right.
They might seem to be in a better position than many other countries, but maybe the Chinese think they don't have enough money.
Right.
But I think more than money now, we need to put minds into getting more bang out of that buck all over.
Right. How would you do that? You think theaterization is one way of ensuring we get more bang out of the buck?
I think so, because theaterization is enables joint planning to be executed jointly in a more effective manner. I think there can be no argument to that, but there are different viewpoints about it.
Right.
Jointness is nothing new. It's the old principle of cooperation. We can evolve our own joint commands. Perhaps theater is a wrong term to use for that. We are basically talking about joint commands which operate along some theaters, which can be more dynamic.
Right. So we're being told about the Maritime Theatre Command, which will be centered around the Indian Navy, of course. How does this benefit the Indian Navy, and especially in the Indian Ocean region? Does it give you more resources? Because I think the big thing would be the Indian Air Force joining in.
I have a different viewpoint about the prefix Maritime to this theatre command, and I had written about it to say that just call it the Southern Command.
Right.
It's very much joint.
Right.
It coincidentally covers much of the maritime dimension, but that's not the only dimension, because this has to both protect the forts of our potential and actual partners in the Indian Ocean. We have been under Sagar.
Yes.
We have committed to providing certain security if they ask for it.
Yes.
So we need to do that. So forts and fleets are again inherent to that, and it will still be a predominantly maritime domain for planning and prosecution and protection. But I don't think we need to use the word prefix it as a maritime.
So it could be focused on land.
It could just be called the Southern Command.
Right.
And the other commands could be called Western or Eastern or Northern or whatever it is. Indeed, just as we have done for the last 80 years, we have had geographical, cardinal and intercardinal names for all our commands. Even the Chinese just call it Southern Theatre Command and Western Theatre Command without attributing the dominance of any one dimension to that.
Right.
And that brings us to the essential principle of cooperation. When you cooperate like this, the lead dimension in a particular phase may be one dimension, and then others come in. The point is not which dimension one won, but whether we won or not.
From forts to fleets and of course theatre commands. What a fascinating discussion it's been with you, Admiral Shrikhande. I keep saying this, that you have an ability to look over the horizon as the Navy always does. But thank you very much for your time and for your thoughts.